The intergalactic academia gleamed like a collection of crystalline teardrops suspended against the velvet backdrop of space. Inside its transparent corridors, beings from across the universe traversed in pursuit of the highest forms of knowledge. The Academy stood as a testament to the unified progress of sentient species, a place where the most brilliant minds gathered to push the boundaries of understanding. Among these corridors, in the Department of Multidimensional Physics, Professor Zelthar moved with the fluid grace characteristic of his species. The six-limbed academic, with skin that shifted between deep azure and violet depending on his mood, was renowned throughout 3 galaxies for his pioneering work in 5-dimensional physics. His papers on 5D wave-particle interactions had revolutionized interstellar travel, and his theoretical framework for understanding higher dimensional energy transfer had earned him the prestigious Nova Prize 3 times. Today, however, his mood was decidedly violet, the color of frustration among his kind. Incomprehensible, he muttered to himself as he swept through the crystalline lecture hall, his secondary arms gesturing dismissively at the holographic display where student papers hovered, completely missing the fundamental concept of dimensional boundary transcendence. His irritation was directed particularly at one paper, that of Mira Novak, the first human student ever admitted to the Academy's multidimensional physics program. Her admission had been controversial. Humans, after all, were relative newcomers to the galactic community, having achieved reliable faster-than-light travel only a century ago, in 2350. Many faculty members had expressed concerns about a human's ability to comprehend concepts that transcended the limited 4-dimensional existence they had evolved within. Zelthar had been among the skeptics, though he had grudgingly acknowledged the potential value of fresh perspectives. Now, reviewing Mira's midterm examination, his skepticism hardened into certainty. "Computer, mark Novak's examination as failed," he commanded. "Add notation. Student demonstrates fundamental inability to comprehend pure 5D concepts. Recommended remedial studies in basic 4-dimensional physics before continuing." The artificial intelligence running the Academy's systems complied with a soft chime, and the holographic display changed to reflect the failing grade. Zelthar nodded, satisfied that academic standards had been maintained. He was not being cruel, he told himself. He was being realistic. Some species simply lacked the neural architecture to comprehend certain concepts. It wasn't discrimination. It was biological reality. Little did he know that the aftermath of this decision would challenge not only his understanding of human capabilities, but the very nature of multidimensional physics itself. Mira Novak stared at her exam results with disbelief that quickly transformed into rage. Failed? With a recommendation for remedial studies? The holographic display hovered before her in her dormitory room, the scarlet F seeming to pulse with each beat of her heart. She'd spent weeks preparing for this examination, had sacrificed sleep and social activities to understand concepts that strained against the limits of human comprehension. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, pushing a strand of dark hair away from her face. "I understood the concepts. She trailed off, knowing the problem wasn't comprehension. It was communication. She understood 5-dimensional physics in a way that felt intuitive, but translating that understanding into the formal language expected by Professor Zelthar proved challenging. Mira had always been different from other physics students. While her peers relied on equations and formulas, Mira saw patterns, colors, and shapes. Physics, to her, was as much art as it was science. This unorthodox approach had served her well on Earth, where her revolutionary paper on quantum entanglement had caught the attention of the intergalactic academia's talent scouts. But here, among beings who had evolved in environments that naturally exposed them to higher dimensions, her unique approach seemed inadequate. "Computer," she said after a moment of contemplation, "show me Professor Zelthar's schedule." Professor Zelthar will be in Laboratory 5D7 until the 20th hour, the AI responded in its melodious voice. Mira checked the time. That gave her 3 hours to prepare her case. She wasn't going to accept this failure without a fight. She'd worked too hard, come too far. If Professor Zelthar thought humans lacked the capacity for 5-dimensional thinking, she would prove him wrong. But first, she needed to better understand where she had gone wrong. She pulled up her examination answers and compared them to the reference materials. The problem wasn't in her mathematical calculations. Those were impeccable. The issue seemed to lie in her conceptual framework, the way she articulated her understanding of how 5-dimensional spaces interacted with 3-dimensional matter. With determined steps, Mira left her dormitory and headed toward the Academy's vast library. If conventional approaches weren't working, perhaps unconventional resources might offer a solution. The library of the Intergalactic Academia was unlike any repository of knowledge on Earth. Rather than physical books or even digital files, information was stored in crystalline structures that responded directly to neural impulses. Visitors interfaced with the library by sitting in specially designed chairs that established a temporary link between their consciousness and the crystal network. Mira settled into one such chair, feeling the familiar tingling sensation as the neural interface activated. "Request," she said aloud, "non-standard approaches to 5-dimensional physics, particularly looking for alternative visualization techniques, metaphorical frameworks, or cross-disciplinary perspectives." The system hummed, and for a moment, Mira feared it would respond with the dreaded, "no relevant materials found." Instead, a holographic index appeared before her, listing a surprising number of resources. Displaying 17 entries matching search parameters, the library AI announced, "Would you like to narrow your search?" "No," Mira said quickly. "This is perfect." She immersed herself in the materials, discovering papers written by beings from species she'd never encountered before. One article, authored by a collective consciousness from the Cygnus cluster, described 5-dimensional physics through what translated roughly as pattern poetry. Another, by a gaseous entity from a super-Jovian planet, explained higher dimensions through what appeared to be musical notation. These unorthodox approaches resonated with Mira. They confirmed what she had suspected. There were many ways to understand and express multidimensional concepts beyond the rigid mathematical formalism favored by Professor Zelthar. Hours passed as Mira absorbed these alternative frameworks. When she finally disconnected from the library system, a plan had begun to form in her mind. She wouldn't just argue with the professor about her grade. She would demonstrate her understanding in a way he couldn't dismiss. With renewed determination, she headed toward Laboratory 5D7. The laboratory door slid open with a whisper, revealing a vast chamber that seemed larger inside than its external dimensions would suggest. A deliberate design feature that served as a practical demonstration of space manipulation. Professor Zelthar stood at the center of the room, all 6 of his arms manipulating controls on a complex apparatus that emitted a soft, pulsating glow. Surrounding him were several graduate students from various species, all observing with expressions of reverence appropriate to their diverse physiologies. Mira hesitated at the threshold. Interrupting the professor during a research session was not considered appropriate, but her determination outweighed her adherence to protocol. She stepped forward. "Professor Zelthar," she said, her voice steady despite her inner turmoil. "May I speak with you regarding my examination?" The alien professor didn't immediately turn. One of his secondary arms made a dismissive gesture, indicating she should wait. Mira stood patiently as he completed whatever delicate adjustment he was making to the equipment. Finally, he turned, his skin shifting to a deeper violet as he recognized her. Student Novak," he said, his voice resonating with harmonic undertones characteristic of his species. "I was expecting you. though not in my research laboratory. Office hours would be more appropriate for grade disputes. This isn't just about the grade, Professor, Mira replied. It's about the assertion that I'm fundamentally incapable of understanding five-dimensional physics. The graduate students exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. Professor Zelthar noticed their discomfort and gestured toward the exit. Continue your observations of the experiment data. I will return shortly. As they filed out, he turned his attention back to Mira. You have 5 minutes. Student Novak, explain why you believe my assessment is incorrect. Mira had prepared for this moment, but standing before the imposing alien professor, her carefully rehearsed arguments seemed suddenly inadequate. She decided to speak from the heart instead. Professor, I understand that my approach to five-dimensional physics doesn't conform to the standard methodologies taught here. But different doesn't mean wrong or inferior. Humans may have evolved in a primarily three-dimensional environment, but our minds are capable of abstract thought that transcends our physical limitations. Professor Zelthar's upper eyes narrowed, while his lower set remained fixed on Mira with unblinking intensity. Abstract thought is not sufficient for advanced physics. Student Novak, precision is required. Your examination answers demonstrated a poetic approach to scientific concepts. Interesting, perhaps, but not academically rigorous. But that's just it, Mira countered, gaining confidence. My understanding is rigorous, but my expression of that understanding takes a different form. I see five-dimensional interactions as patterns, as relationships between entities, rather than as abstract mathematical constructs. Patterns? The professor's skin rippled with what might have been amusement or derision. Mira couldn't tell. Five-dimensional physics is not a tapestry to be admired. Student Novak, it is a precise discipline that requires exact language. Mira took a deep breath. Then let me demonstrate my understanding in a different way, not through traditional examination questions, but through practical application. This caught the professor's attention. His secondary arms, which had been gesturing dismissively, grew still. What do you propose? Give me access to the lab during off hours. Let me work with the equipment. Design an experiment that demonstrates five-dimensional principles. Judge me by what I can do, not just by how I articulate concepts on an examination. Professor Zelthar was silent for a long moment, his skin cycling through shades of blue and violet as he considered the request. Finally, he spoke. Your proposal is unorthodox, but not without merit. Very well. You may use Laboratory 5D3, the teaching lab, not this research facility, during the night cycle for 1 week. At the end of that time, you will present your experiment and findings. If you demonstrate genuine understanding of five-dimensional principles, I will reconsider your examination grade. Relief washed over Mira. Thank you, Professor. Do not thank me yet. Student Novak, Zelthar replied, his tone serious. What I am offering is not an easier path, but a more difficult one. Designing and executing a meaningful experiment is far more challenging than answering examination questions. I understand, Mira said, undaunted. I won't disappoint you. As she turned to leave, Professor Zelthar added, and Student Novak, do not expect assistance from graduate students or other faculty. This must be your work alone if it is to prove anything. Mira nodded and left, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had won a chance, but now she had to make good on her bold claims. The pressure was immense, but so was her determination. What she didn't notice as she departed was the curious expression that passed over Zelthar's alien features. A brief flicker of something that might have been hope. Laboratory 5D3 was smaller than the research facility where Professor Zelthar worked, but it was still impressive by Earth standards, designed for teaching purposes. It contained equipment that allowed students to safely observe and manipulate five-dimensional phenomena on a small scale. Mira spent her first night simply familiarizing herself with the equipment. Much of it was intuitive, designed with interfaces that adapted to the user's species and preferred interaction methods. Other components were more challenging, requiring specialized knowledge that she had to pull from the lab's technical manuals. By the second night, she had begun experimenting. Her approach was methodical, but unconventional. Rather than following established experimental protocols, she designed tests based on her intuitive understanding of how five-dimensional spaces should behave. Automated Laboratory Assistant, record experimental series Novak 1. She instructed the lab's AI system, establishing baseline five-dimensional field stability in varying energy conditions. Recording initiated, the AI confirmed in its neutral voice. Recommend standard safety protocols for five-dimensional field manipulation. Acknowledged, Mira replied, as she carefully adjusted the controls on what looked like a transparent cube suspended in midair. Though cube was a simplification of a shape that occasionally seemed to have more than 6 faces, depending on the angle from which it was viewed. The experiment was designed to test how five-dimensional fields responded to different energy inputs, a fundamental concept that had been covered in the lectures, but that Mira felt she understood differently than how it had been presented. As she worked, hours slipping by unnoticed, Mira began to feel a sense of freedom she had rarely experienced in academic settings. Here, alone in the lab with only the AI assistant, she could follow her intuition, could translate the patterns she saw in her mind into actual experiments without worrying about conforming to expected methodologies. When the first results began to appear on the holographic displays, Mira felt a surge of excitement. The data matched her predictions. Not exactly, but within acceptable parameters. Her understanding, unorthodox as it might be, was yielding accurate results. Assistant, compare experimental results with theoretical models from current academic literature, she requested. The AI processed for a moment before responding. Results show 87% alignment with Zelthar-Doran model of five-dimensional energy transfer. Deviation patterns suggest alternative interpretation of boundary conditions. Mira smiled. The deviations were exactly what she had expected. They represented not errors, but a different conceptual framework. Her framework. She worked through the night and returned the following evening with renewed energy. Each experiment built upon the last, constructing a comprehensive demonstration of five-dimensional principles that aligned with established science while incorporating her unique perspective. On the fourth night, however, she encountered a problem. Her latest experiment, designed to demonstrate how five-dimensional fields could be manipulated to affect three-dimensional matter, wasn't yielding the expected results. The discrepancy was significant enough that it couldn't be attributed to equipment limitations or minor theoretical adjustments. Mira frowned at the holographic display, running her fingers through her hair in frustration. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered. "The principle is sound. The math checks out. Why isn't it working?" "Would you like me to run a diagnostic on the equipment?" the AI assistant offered. "No, it's not the equipment," Mira replied. "It's something conceptual. I'm missing something." She paced the laboratory, trying to visualize the problem from different angles. The traditional approach would be to review the equations, check for errors in the mathematical formulation. But Mira knew the math was correct. The issue lay deeper, in the underlying conceptual framework. What she needed was a different perspective entirely. "Assistant," she said suddenly, "do you have creativity subroutines?" "I have adaptive problem-solving capabilities," the AI replied cautiously. "However, true creativity as understood by biological entities is beyond my programming. But you can help me think differently about this problem. I can offer alternative analytical frameworks based on my database of scientific methodologies." Mira considered this. "Can you access educational materials from Earth?" Specifically, I'm interested in how physics is taught to young children before they've been exposed to formal mathematical notation. There was a pause before the AI responded. Accessing Earth Educational Archives. Restriction level. Basic. Processing request. A new holographic display appeared, showing colorful illustrations from elementary school science textbooks. Simple diagrams explained concepts like gravity, magnetism, and light using analogies and visual metaphors rather than equations. Mira studied these materials, feeling a sense of recognition. This was how she had first encountered physics as a child, not as abstract mathematics, but as stories about how the universe worked, illustrated with vibrant colors and simplified shapes. "This is helpful," she said, "but I need something more specific to our problem." She considered further, then had a sudden inspiration. "Assistant, do you have access to art supplies?" "Physical art supplies are available in the Materials Fabrication Unit," the AI confirmed. "Please specify requirements." "I need paper, large sheets, and colored drawing implements. Crayons, if possible." "Fabricating requested materials." A panel in the wall slid open, revealing sheets of synthetic paper and a box containing what appeared to be crayons, though they were made from a material unknown on Earth. Mira laid the paper on a large table and began to draw. She wasn't an artist by any formal definition, but she had always used visual aids to help herself think through complex problems. Now, she let her intuition guide her hand, using different colors to represent different dimensional aspects of the problem she was trying to solve. She drew spirals and intersecting circles, used color gradients to indicate energy densities, and created patterns that represented how she visualized five-dimensional fields interacting with three-dimensional space. To anyone else, it might have looked like abstract art or the doodlings of a child. To Mira, it was a visual language expressing concepts that defied conventional notation. As she drew, connections began to form in her mind. She saw where her experimental approach had gone wrong, not in the mathematics, but in the conceptual framework. She had been thinking too linearly about a phenomenon that was fundamentally nonlinear. "That's it," she whispered, stepping back to view her colorful creation. "The field doesn't propagate through the dimensions sequentially. It exists in all of them simultaneously, with varying intensities." She turned to the equipment with renewed purpose, adjusting parameters based on her new understanding. When she ran the experiment again, the results were dramatically different. The five-dimensional field successfully manipulated the three-dimensional test object, causing it to exhibit properties that defied conventional physics. "Assistant, record and analyze results," Mira instructed, her voice trembling with excitement. "Recording complete," the AI responded after a moment. "Analysis indicates successful demonstration of cross-dimensional influence. Results exceed predictions of current theoretical models by 23%. Mira stared at the readout in disbelief. Not only had her experiment worked, but it had outperformed existing theories. Her unorthodox approach, combining intuitive visual thinking with rigorous experimental methodology, had yielded insights that conventional approaches had missed. As the night cycle ended, and she prepared to leave the laboratory, Mira carefully preserved her crayon drawings. They might look childish to others, but they represented a breakthrough in her understanding, and potentially in the field itself. What she didn't realize was that the laboratory AI had been recording not just her experimental results, but her entire process, including the creation of the colorful drawings. And that recording was automatically filed in the Academy's research database, accessible to all faculty members, including Professor Zelthar. Professor Zelthar had not expected to be impressed. When he accessed the teaching laboratory's logs to check on student Novak's progress, he had anticipated finding evidence of either fumbling incompetence or, at best, basic competence following standard experimental protocols. What he found instead left him momentarily speechless. The holographic replay showed Mira working with an intuitive grace that belied her species' limited experience with higher dimensions. More surprising still were her methods, particularly the colorful drawings that preceded her most successful experiment. "Computer, enhance visual on time index 3.47, he commanded. The display zoomed in on Mira's crayon drawings. To most observers, they would appear to be meaningless scribbles, perhaps aesthetically pleasing, but scientifically worthless. But Zelthar, with his comprehensive understanding of five-dimensional physics, recognized something extraordinary. Hidden within the childlike artwork was a sophisticated representation of five-dimensional field dynamics, not expressed in equations or standard notation, but in patterns of color and shape that somehow captured the essence of the phenomena more completely than conventional models. "Extraordinary," he murmured, his skin shifting to a bright cyan of intellectual excitement. "She's seeing it, truly seeing it." He studied the experimental results that followed Mira's artistic breakthrough. The data confirmed what the drawings had suggested, a novel approach to five-dimensional field manipulation that yielded enhanced efficiency and control. For a moment, professional jealousy flared within him. This human student, this newcomer to advanced physics, had stumbled upon insights that had eluded him despite decades of research. But that emotion was quickly replaced by scholarly excitement. New knowledge was the ultimate goal of science, regardless of its source. Professor Zelthar made a decision. He would observe student Novak's work directly the following night. If what he had seen in the recordings was indicative of her true understanding, then his assessment of human capabilities might require significant revision. Mira returned to the laboratory the next evening, eager to build upon her breakthrough. She had spent the day refining her ideas, creating more detailed drawings in her dormitory, and translating them into experimental parameters. She was so focused on setting up her equipment that she didn't immediately notice she wasn't alone. "Your approach is unorthodox, Student Novak." The voice startled her. She turned to find Professor Zelthar standing near the entrance, his four eyes studying her with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Professor," she acknowledged, trying to hide her surprise. "I wasn't expecting you." Clearly, his skin rippled with subtle color changes that Mira couldn't interpret. "I reviewed the logs from your previous sessions. Your methods are unconventional." Mira straightened her posture, ready to defend her work. "But effective." "Yes," the professor agreed, surprising her. "Effective indeed, which raises interesting questions." He moved further into the laboratory, his gaze falling on the crayon drawings Mira had brought with her. "These visual representations," he said, gesturing toward them with one of his secondary arms. "Explain their significance." Mira hesitated. How could she explain something that was so intuitive to her, but so foreign to traditional academic approaches? "They're how I see five-dimensional interactions," she said finally. "Not as equations, but as patterns, relationships between different aspects of dimensional space." "And the colors?" "They represent different energy states, different potentials. The blue spirals here," she pointed to a particular pattern, "show how a five-dimensional field can wrap around a three-dimensional object without directly intersecting it, creating what you call dimensional shadow effects." Professor Zelthar was silent for a long moment, studying the drawings. Finally, he looked up at Mira with an expression she couldn't read. "You have no formal training in five-dimensional visualization techniques," he stated. "No," Mira confirmed. "Earth science is still developing those concepts." "Then how did you arrive at these particular representations?" Mira shrugged slightly. "They just make sense to me. It's how I've always visualized complex systems, even before I had the mathematical language to describe them." The professor made a sound that might have been the equivalent of a thoughtful in his species. "Show me your planned experiment for tonight," he said. Encouraged by his apparent interest, Mira explained her next steps. She intended to build upon her previous success, exploring how five-dimensional fields could be structured to create specific effects in three-dimensional space, potentially leading to applications in energy transfer and matter manipulation. As she spoke, she referenced her drawings frequently, pointing out how certain patterns represented specific interactions she hoped to achieve. Professor Zelthar listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes on a holographic pad. When she finished, he was silent again, his skin cycling through shades of blue that suggested deep thought. "Proceed with your experiment, Student Novak," he said finally. "I will observe." Mira felt a mixture of nervousness and determination as she began setting up the equipment under the professor's watchful gaze. She tried to focus on the task at hand rather than on his presence, but it was difficult not to be self-conscious. The experiment was more complex than her previous attempts, involving the careful manipulation of multiple five-dimensional fields to create a specific pattern of influence on a test object. As she worked, she referred to her crayon drawings repeatedly, translating the visual patterns into equipment settings. Professor Zelthar observed in silence, his expression unreadable to human eyes. Occasionally, he would make notes or adjust his position to get a better view of a particular aspect of the setup, but he offered neither assistance nor criticism. When everything was ready, Mira took a deep breath. "Initiating experiment sequence," she announced, more for her own benefit than for the professor's. She activated the equipment, and the laboratory filled with a soft, pulsating glow as the five-dimensional fields came into being. Holographic displays showed real-time data from the experiment, tracking energy levels, field stability, and the effects on the test object. For the first few minutes, everything proceeded as expected. The fields formed according to Mira's parameters, and the test object began to exhibit the predicted responses. But then, something unexpected happened. The fields began to interact in ways Mira hadn't anticipated, creating patterns more complex and beautiful than she had designed. "That's not right," she muttered, reaching for the controls to stabilize the experiment. "Wait," Professor Zelthar said, his voice sharper than she'd ever heard it. "Don't interfere yet." Mira hesitated, then pulled her hand back from the controls. The unexpected field patterns continued to evolve, creating effects that should have been impossible according to standard theories. The test object, a simple cube of specialized material designed to respond to five-dimensional influences, began to transform. Its edges blurred, not as if becoming physically indistinct, but as if extending into dimensions beyond normal perception. It seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, exhibiting properties that defied categorization. "Extraordinary," Professor Zelthar whispered, his skin now a brilliant cyan that Mira had never seen before. "You've created a spontaneous dimensional resonance cascade." "Is that good?" Mira asked uncertainly. "It's unprecedented," the professor replied. "This phenomenon has been theorized, but never successfully demonstrated in a controlled environment." As they watched, the cascade effect stabilized into a new pattern, one that matched, almost exactly, one of Mira's crayon drawings. It was as if the universe itself had recognized the truth in her childlike art and had reshaped reality to conform to it. Professor Zelthar turned to Mira, all four of his eyes wide with what might have been awe. "Your drawings," he said, gesturing toward them. "They're not just visualizations. They're predictive models of five-dimensional behavior at a fundamental level." Mira stared at the experiment, then at her drawings, struggling to process the implications. "But they're just how I see things," she said. "They're not based on any established theory." "Perhaps," the professor replied. "That is precisely why they work. You are not constrained by preconceptions about how five-dimensional physics should behave. You see it as it truly is." The experiment continued to run, stable now in its new configuration. The data streaming across the holographic displays confirmed what they were seeing. a new type of five-dimensional interaction that defied existing theoretical frameworks, but that functioned with remarkable efficiency. "We need to document this properly," Professor Zelthar said, his academic instincts taking over, "and replicate it under controlled conditions. If these results can be verified, they represent a significant advancement in our understanding of multidimensional physics." Mira nodded, still somewhat dazed by the turn of events. What had begun as an attempt to prove her competence had somehow led to a genuine scientific breakthrough. As they worked together to document the experiment, the dynamics between them shifted subtly. Professor Zelthar no longer treated Mira as a student struggling to grasp basic concepts, but as a colleague with valuable insights to contribute. He asked questions about her visual approach, listened carefully to her explanations, and offered his own observations without condescension. By the time they finished, the night cycle was almost over. The laboratory's automated systems had recorded every aspect of the unexpected phenomenon, and Professor Zelthar had made extensive notes on his holographic pad. "Student Novak," he said as they prepared to leave, "I believe an apology is in order. My assessment of your capabilities was incorrect." Mira smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Professor." "Don't thank me yet," he replied, his tone serious despite the now pleasant blue of his skin. "What happened here tonight will be scrutinized by the entire scientific community. There will be skepticism, criticism, demands for explanation and justification. The path ahead will not be easy." "I understand," Mira said, though she wasn't sure she fully did. The implications of their discovery were still sinking in. "I will present our findings to the Academy Council," the professor continued. "They will want to see a formal presentation, of course. Are you prepared for that?" Mira thought about standing before the council, composed of the most brilliant scientific minds from across the galaxy, and explaining her crayon-based approach to five-dimensional physics. The idea was terrifying, but also exhilarating. "Yes," she said with more confidence than she felt. "I'm ready." Professor Zelthar nodded, a gesture he had adopted from working with humans. "Then rest, Student Novak. Tomorrow, we begin preparing for what may be a rather significant scientific controversy." As they parted ways outside the laboratory, Mira realized that, whatever happened next, she had already achieved something important. She had proven, to herself and to Professor Zelthar, that human intuition and creativity had a place in the study of the universe's deepest mysteries. The news spread quickly throughout the intergalactic academia. By the following day, the academic community was abuzz with rumors about the breakthrough in Laboratory 5D3. Some accounts claimed that the human student had accidentally stumbled upon a new phenomenon. Others suggested that Professor Zelthar had made the discovery and was generously sharing credit. The truth, as usual, was more complex. Mira found herself suddenly the center of attention. Students from various species approached her in the common areas, asking questions about her methodology and findings. Some were genuinely curious. Others were clearly skeptical that a human could have contributed meaningfully to advanced five-dimensional physics. Professor Zelthar, meanwhile, faced questions from his colleagues. Many were surprised by his apparent endorsement of such an unorthodox approach to science. Zelthar had always been known as a traditionalist, a staunch defender of rigorous mathematical formalism. His sudden embrace of what some dismissively called crayon physics seemed out of character. The Academy Council scheduled a special session to review the discovery. Such sessions were rare, reserved for findings that potentially represented significant paradigm shifts in scientific understanding. The fact that the Council had called for a review so quickly indicated both the potential importance of the discovery and the controversy surrounding it. In the days leading up to the Council session, Mira and Professor Zelthar worked together to prepare their presentation. They replicated the experiment multiple times, documenting every aspect meticulously. They developed a theoretical framework that attempted to reconcile Mira's intuitive approach with established scientific principles. And most controversially, they incorporated Mira's crayon drawings as an integral part of their explanatory model. These visual representations cannot be dismissed as mere illustrations, Professor Zelthar argued during one of their preparation sessions. They contain information about five-dimensional relationships that our standard notation fails to capture. Mira, who had initially been hesitant to emphasize her unorthodox methods, found herself encouraged by the professor's support. "It's not that the standard notation is wrong," she explained. "It's just incomplete. It's like trying to describe a symphony using only mathematical frequency values. Technically accurate, but missing the essence of the music." The professor's upper eyes blinked in what Mira had come to recognize as an expression of insight. "An apt metaphor," he said. "We will use that in the presentation." Not everyone was supportive of their approach. Several senior faculty members expressed concerns about the direction of the research. Dr. Vreen, the head of the theoretical physics department, was particularly vocal in his criticism. "This is not science," he declared during a faculty meeting that Mira was not invited to, but heard about later. "It is, at best, a lucky accident being misinterpreted through a lens of artistic mysticism. At worst, it is a deliberate attempt to undermine the rigor of our academic standards." When Professor Zelthar defended the validity of their findings, Dr. Vreen had reportedly reminded him of his own failed attempts to introduce unorthodox methodologies early in his career. "You, of all people, should remember the importance of maintaining scientific discipline," Dr. Vreen had said. "Or have you forgotten the resonance theory debacle?" The comment had struck a nerve. When Zelthar returned to their work after the meeting, his skin was a dark purple that Mira had never seen before. "What's the resonance theory debacle?" she asked cautiously, sensing it might be a sensitive topic. The professor was silent for a long moment before responding. "Early in my career, I proposed an alternative framework for understanding five-dimensional interactions. It was based on principles of harmonic resonance, rather than the standard particle field model. My ideas were not well received." "What happened?" "I was publicly criticized. My research funding was threatened, and I was advised to abandon the line of inquiry if I wished to advance in my career." His skin rippled with darker purple. "So I did. I returned to conventional approaches, became a staunch defender of traditional methodologies, and eventually achieved the academic success that had eluded me." Mira studied him, seeing the alien professor in a new light. "That's why you failed me on the midterm examination, isn't it? Because my approach reminded you of your own abandoned theories." Professor Zelthar's secondary arms made a gesture that might have been the equivalent of a sigh. "Perhaps, though I did not realize it at the time." "And now," Mira asked, "why support this research when it could put you in the same position again?" "Because," the professor said, his skin gradually shifting to a more resolved blue, "your experiment worked, and in science, results ultimately matter more than methodology. If we continue to ignore approaches that yield successful predictions simply because they don't conform to our aesthetic preferences for how science should be done, we limit our understanding of the universe." Mira smiled. "That's the most human thing I've ever heard you say, Professor." Zelthar made a sound that Mira interpreted as a chuckle. "Perhaps humans are not the only species capable of learning and growth." With renewed determination, they returned to their preparations for the council presentation. Whatever opposition they might face, they were committed to defending the validity of their discovery and the unconventional methods that had led to it. The council chamber of the intergalactic academia was designed to accommodate beings of widely varying physiologies and perceptual systems. Its architecture shifted subtly depending on who occupied it, ensuring that all participants could engage comfortably regardless of their species' specific needs. Today, The chamber was configured for a formal, scientific presentation. A central platform stood ready for speakers, surrounded by tiered seating, where the 12 members of the Academy Council would observe and evaluate. Additional seating around the perimeter would accommodate other interested faculty and students. As the designated time approached, the chamber filled quickly. News of the controversial discovery had spread throughout the Academy, drawing an unusually large crowd for what would normally have been a specialized academic presentation. Mira waited nervously in an antechamber, reviewing her notes one last time. She wore the formal academic robes of the Academy, specially tailored for human physiology. Professor Zelthar stood nearby, his skin a calm blue that belied the significance of the moment. "Remember," he said, "focus on the results. The experimental data speaks for itself, regardless of how we arrived at it." Mira nodded, though she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The methodology, her crayon drawings and intuitive approach, was integral to the discovery. To downplay it would be dishonest and would undermine the very innovation they were presenting. A chime sounded, indicating it was time to enter. The doors to the council chamber slid open, and Mira took a deep breath before following Professor Zelthar inside. The chamber hushed as they made their way to the central platform. Mira could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes, or equivalent sensory organs, following their progress. Among the council members, she recognized Dr. Vreen, whose expression, to the extent that his species had recognizable expressions to humans, suggested skepticism bordering on hostility. The head of the council, an ancient being named Zel, whose species was so long-lived that they measured their age in centuries, activated the formal proceedings. "We are gathered to evaluate the findings presented by Professor Zelthar and student Novak regarding a novel approach to five-dimensional field manipulation," Zel announced, their voice resonating with harmonics that suggested both authority and age. "The council will hear the presentation, examine the evidence, and determine whether these findings merit official recognition and further research support." With that, Zel gestured for them to begin. Professor Zelthar stepped forward first, providing context for their discovery. He explained the established theories of five-dimensional physics, the limitations of current approaches, and the serendipitous circumstances that had led to their breakthrough. "What we present today," he concluded, "is not a rejection of established science, but an expansion of it, a complementary approach that offers new insights into phenomena that have resisted conventional analysis." He then introduced Mira, who stepped forward with more confidence than she felt. She had decided to be direct about her methodology, neither apologizing for its unconventionality nor overselling its significance. "My approach to five-dimensional physics is based on visual pattern recognition," she began. "Where traditional methods use mathematical formalism to describe multidimensional interactions, I use spatial and color relationships to represent the same phenomena." She activated the holographic display, showing side by side her crayon drawings and the corresponding experimental results. The correlation was striking. Patterns that Mira had intuitively drawn matched almost exactly the behavior of five-dimensional fields in their experiments. "These visual models," she continued, "allowed us to predict and then demonstrate a phenomenon that has been theoretically possible, but practically unachievable using standard approaches, a stable dimensional resonance cascade." She proceeded to explain the technical details of their discovery, translating her visual concepts into the more formal language of academic physics when possible, but not hesitating to use her own terminology when conventional language fell short. As she spoke, she could see reactions varying among the audience. Some leaned forward with evident interest. Others exchanged skeptical glances. Dr. Vreen's expression had hardened into what appeared to be outright disapproval. When Mira finished her portion of the presentation, Professor Zelthar returned to discuss the implications and potential applications of their discovery. Together, they presented a comprehensive case for the validity and importance of their findings. As they concluded, the council chamber remained silent for a moment before Zell spoke again. The council will now question the presenters. Dr. Vreen, you may begin. Dr. Vreen rose from his seat, his elongated form towering over most other beings in the chamber. Professor Zelthar, he said, his voice carrying a subtle harmonic that Mira interpreted as condescension. You have built your career on mathematical rigor and formal analytical methods. Yet you now endorse what appears to be an artistic, rather than scientific approach to physics. How do you reconcile this apparent contradiction? Professor Zelthar's skin remained a steady blue as he replied, There is no contradiction. Dr. Vreen, science is ultimately about understanding reality, not about adhering to particular methodologies. When a new approach yields demonstrable results that advance our understanding, it is our duty as scientists to consider it seriously, regardless of its origin or form. And you believe that childlike drawings constitute a serious scientific approach? Dr. Vreen pressed. Before Professor Zelthar could respond, Mira stepped forward. With respect, Dr. Vreen, the visual representations are not childlike in concept, only in execution. They express complex, multidimensional relationships in a form that happens to be accessible to human intuition. The fact that they accurately predicted experimental outcomes that were not predictable using standard methods, suggests they contain valid scientific information, regardless of their aesthetic presentation. Dr. Vreen's attention shifted to Mira, his sensory appendages quivering slightly. Student Novak, are you suggesting that your artistic intuition is superior to the mathematical frameworks developed by the finest minds across multiple civilizations over centuries of rigorous study? Not superior, Mira replied carefully. Different, complementary. Mathematics is an incredibly powerful tool for describing reality, but it is not the only tool. Visual thinking, pattern recognition, metaphorical reasoning, these are also ways of understanding the universe. They can capture aspects of reality that might be overlooked in purely mathematical analyses. Another council member, a crystalline entity named Thus, joined the questioning. I am curious about the reproducibility of your approach. Can other researchers, who do not share your particular intuitive capabilities, make use of these visual models? This was a question Mira and Professor Zelthar had anticipated. We believe so, the professor answered. While student Novak's intuitive process may be unique to her, the resulting visual models can be studied, analyzed, and potentially formalized into a more generally applicable system. In fact, we have already begun developing translation protocols between these visual representations and more traditional mathematical notation. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, with council members probing every aspect of their research. Some questions were technical, focusing on specific experimental results. Others were more philosophical, challenging the very nature of scientific methodology. Throughout, Mira and Professor Zelthar maintained a united front, defending their work with a combination of technical expertise and principled argument. By the time the questioning ended, Mira felt mentally exhausted, but also strangely exhilarated. Whatever the council decided, she had stood her ground and articulated her ideas clearly. Zell rose to address the chamber once more. The council will now deliberate in private. All others are asked to vacate the chamber until a decision is reached. As Mira and Professor Zelthar left the platform, the audience began filing out of the chamber. Some approached them with words of support or interest. Others maintained a careful distance, as if not wanting to be associated with potentially controversial research. In the corridor outside, Mira leaned against a wall, suddenly feeling the full weight of the ordeal. That was intense, she said. Professor Zelthar's skin had shifted to a more relaxed turquoise. You performed admirably, student Novak. Regardless of the council's decision, you have demonstrated both scientific insight and personal courage. Do you think they'll accept our findings? The professor's secondary arms made a gesture that Mira had learned to interpret as uncertainty. The evidence is compelling, but academic institutions are often resistant to methodological innovation. Change comes slowly to science, despite our rhetoric about the pursuit of truth. They didn't have to wait long for an answer. Less than an hour later, a chime summoned them back to the council chamber. The audience returned as well, filling the space with anticipatory murmurs. Zell stood at the center of the platform, their ancient form seeming to shimmer slightly in the chamber's light. When all had settled, they spoke. The council has reached a decision regarding the findings presented by Professor Zelthar and student Novak. The chamber fell silent. Every being present focused on Zell's next words. The experimental results demonstrating a stable dimensional resonance cascade are accepted as valid and significant. The methodology employed, while unorthodox, has yielded outcomes that cannot be dismissed. A wave of reaction passed through the audience. Surprise, approval, skepticism, all mingled together. However, Zell continued, the council recommends that further research in this direction be conducted within a more structured framework. The visual modeling approach should be developed into a formalized system that can be taught, evaluated, and replicated by other researchers. Mira felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that their findings had been accepted, but concern about the structured framework requirement. Would formalizing her intuitive approach strip it of the very qualities that made it effective? Furthermore, Zell added, the council recognizes the potential for this discovery to open new avenues of investigation in multidimensional physics. Therefore, a special research initiative will be established, co-directed by Professor Zelthar and student Novak, to explore the implications and applications of their findings. This announcement caused a stir in the chamber. Such initiatives were rarely established, and even more rarely co-directed by a student. It represented not just acceptance of their work, but a significant endorsement of its importance. Finally, Zell concluded, in recognition of her contributions, student Novak's academic status is elevated to research associate, with all attendant privileges and responsibilities. Mira stared in disbelief. Research associate was a position normally reserved for those who had completed advanced degrees and demonstrated significant scholarly achievement. It represented a leap of several academic ranks, an unprecedented advancement for a first-year student. As the formal proceedings concluded, Professor Zelthar turned to Mira, his skin now a brilliant cyan that she had come to associate with genuine pleasure. Congratulations, Research Associate Novak, he said, using her new title. I don't know what to say, Mira replied, still processing the council's decision. Say that you're ready to continue our work, the professor suggested. We have much to do to develop this new approach to physics. Mira nodded, her initial shock giving way to determination. I'm ready. As they left the council chamber, they were approached by various faculty members and students, some offering congratulations, others expressing interest in their research. Even Dr. Vreen acknowledged them with a formal nod, though his expression suggested he remained unconvinced of the wisdom of the council's decision. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. The Special Research Initiative was established, with laboratory space and resources allocated to their work. Graduate students from various departments expressed interest in joining the project, attracted by the novelty of the approach and the opportunity to be part of potentially groundbreaking research. Mira found herself in the unexpected position of helping to develop a curriculum to teach her visual approach to five-dimensional physics. Working with Professor Zelthar and educational specialists, she attempted to systematize what had been an intuitive process, identifying key principles and translating them into teachable concepts. It was challenging work, requiring her to examine her own thought processes in ways she never had before. But it was also deeply rewarding to see others begin to grasp and apply her approach. Not everyone embraced the new methodology. Some faculty members remained skeptical, viewing it as a curious anomaly rather than a legitimate alternative to established approaches. Some students struggled with the visual thinking required, just as Mira had initially struggled with the formal mathematical notation of traditional physics. But there were also unexpected successes. Several species with neural architectures, very different from both humans and Professor Zelthar's kind, found Mira's visual approach more intuitive than traditional methods. For them, the colorful patterns and spatial relationships provided a more accessible entry point to five-dimensional concepts than abstract mathematics. As the research initiative gained momentum, news of their work spread beyond the academia to the wider scientific community. Articles appeared in prestigious journals, some dismissive, others intrigued. Invitations arrived for Mira and Professor Zelthar to present their findings at conferences across the galaxy. The Crayon equation, as it had been nicknamed, somewhat to Mira's embarrassment, became a topic of heated debate in scientific circles. Was it a legitimate new approach to physics, or a curious dead end? Was it a sign that academic standards were being relaxed, or evidence that those standards had been too rigid all along? Through it all, Mira and Professor Zelthar continued their research, refining their understanding of the dimensional resonance cascade and exploring its potential applications. Their working relationship evolved into a genuine collaboration, with each contributing unique perspectives and insights. 6 months after the council presentation, they achieved another breakthrough. Using Mira's visual models as a guide, they developed a method for controlling the resonance cascade with unprecedented precision, allowing for the manipulation of matter in ways that had previously been thought impossible. The practical implications were enormous: more efficient energy transfer, new approaches to space travel, even theoretical pathways to technologies that had existed only in science fiction. The skepticism that had greeted their initial findings began to give way to excitement about the possibilities their work had opened up. 1 year after Mira had failed her midterm examination, she stood before a new class of students in the Department of Multidimensional Physics. The lecture hall was filled to capacity, with beings from dozens of species attending either in person or via holographic projection. The course was titled Integrative Approaches to Five-Dimensional Physics, and it represented the formal integration of Mira's methodology into the academia's curriculum. It was an elective course, but its popularity had surprised everyone, including Mira herself. On the transparent teaching surface before her, Mira had arranged an array of colored markers. Next to them was a copy of the traditional textbook, Principles of Five-Dimensional Physics, the same text she had struggled with a year earlier. "Welcome to Integrative Approaches to Five-Dimensional Physics," she began, looking out at the diverse faces, or equivalent sensory apparatuses, of her students. In this course, we will explore how different ways of thinking about dimensionality can lead to new insights and applications. She picked up the textbook. Traditional approaches to five-dimensional physics rely on mathematical formalism, elegant, precise, and powerful. She set the book down and picked up a red marker. Alternative approaches, including visual modeling, engage different cognitive pathways and can reveal patterns that might otherwise remain hidden. With confident strokes, she began to draw on the transparent surface, spirals, intersecting circles, gradients of color. To the untrained eye, it might have looked like abstract art, but to those who had studied the new methodology, it was a precise representation of a five-dimensional field configuration. "Our goal is not to replace one approach with another," Mira continued, "but to develop the ability to move fluidly between different modes of understanding, to see the universe not just as equations or just as patterns, but as a complex reality that can be approached from multiple perspectives." As she spoke, Professor Zelthar entered quietly at the back of the lecture hall. He had not been scheduled to attend, but he had wanted to witness this moment. the formal beginning of what some were now calling art science. The integration of intuitive and analytical approaches to understanding the universe. The professor's skin shifted to a satisfied cyan as he observed Mira confidently leading the class through exercises that combined traditional mathematical notation with visual representations. The students were engaged, asking questions that showed genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. This was what science should be, he thought. Not a rigid adherence to established methods, but a constant openness to new ways of discovering truth. He had forgotten that once, had allowed his early setbacks to turn him into a defender of orthodoxy rather than a seeker of understanding. Mira had reminded him of what it meant to be a true scientist, and in doing so, she had not only changed his perspective, but had begun to change the field itself. As the lecture continued, Professor Zelthar slipped out as quietly as he had entered. He had his own research to attend to, a new project inspired by Mira's approach, but taking it in directions she hadn't yet explored. They would discuss it at their regular collaboration meeting later in the day, two colleagues working together to expand the boundaries of human and alien understanding alike. Outside the lecture hall, in the crystalline corridors of the intergalactic academia, students from a dozen worlds hurried to various classes. Among them was a young being from a species that had only recently joined the galactic community, the first of their kind to be accepted to the academy. They paused outside the lecture hall, listening to Mira's voice explaining concepts that their own people had barely begun to contemplate. On their datapad was a schedule for the coming term, with integrative approaches to five-dimensional physics, highlighted as a priority course. Perhaps here, they thought, they would find a way to bridge the gap between their own intuitive understanding of the universe and the formal knowledge of more established civilizations. Perhaps here, like the human teacher inside, they could transform their unique perspective into a contribution that would benefit all. With renewed determination, they continued down the corridor, another seeker of knowledge in an institution that was, slowly but surely, learning to value diversity of thought as much as it valued rigor and precision. And in the lecture hall, Mira continued her lesson, her colorful markers creating patterns on the transparent surface that represented truths about the universe that had once seemed beyond human comprehension. Each stroke was a bridge between worlds, between ways of knowing, between beings who had evolved under different stars, but who shared a common curiosity about the nature of reality. It was, she reflected as she drew, exactly where she was meant to be.